The history of the Holocaust is usually told through figures and documents, but behind those statistics there were children who survived against all logic. Their lives were not those of fortunate ones, but those of human beings forced to grow up among stolen identities, imposed silences, and fragmented memories. Each one of them carried an invisible wound that marked their adulthood and was transmitted to their families. Today, elderly, they are the last generation capable of narrating in the first person what it meant to lose childhood in the midst of extermination. Listening to their voices is not only an exercise of memory, it is a duty toward the millions who did not return. The children who survived the Holocaust, the improbable existence. The war had ended and Europe was covered with physical and spiritual ruins. In the midst of that devastation, among the destroyed cities, the refugee camps, and the returning trains, appeared a group of human beings that seemed to contradict any logic of extermination, the children who had survived the Holocaust. They were few, barely a minimal fraction of the more than 1.5 million who had been persecuted, deported, and murdered. Their very existence was a scandal against the statistics of death, an anomaly that forced one to ask how they had managed to live when everything was prepared for them to disappear without leaving a trace. The survival of a child during those years implied the combination of chance, the will of others, and an extraordinary dose of resistance. The destiny of Thomas Bergenthal, for example, is explained as much by his own ingenuity as by the succession of improbable circumstances that led him to come out alive from Auschwitz. At 10 years old, he had already gone through ghettos, concentration camps, and death marches. His childhood, which should have been made of games and learning, was in reality a succession of escapes, hungers, and blows. And yet Thomas survived. Later, when he tried to remember those years, he said that he had felt a fortunate child, not for having lived, but because each day he found within himself the capacity to continue even when death seemed to be waiting for him only a few steps away. That feeling of being fortunate was common in many of these children, although charged with a bitter contradiction. They were so in comparison with their brothers, cousins, or schoolmates who had died in gas chambers or in the forests before the firing squads. But at the same time, they knew themselves to be bearers of an irremediable loneliness. For those who were left orphans, each day of life after 1945 was crossed by absence. Guta Sternbuch, who survived hidden and was later rescued, summed it up in a devastating phrase: "I could smile, I could run, but everything in me was a memory of those who had not returned." The life of a surviving child was marked from the beginning by the fragmentation of identity. Many had had to assume false names during the war to hide in farms, convents, or houses of non-Jewish families. They learned to respond to those names with the naturalness of one who plays a role to save oneself, to the point of forgetting their true origin. Decades later, some still had doubts about what they were called at birth. Judith Koppel, taken from one refuge to another, asked insistently as an adult, "What is my true name?" That question, so simple for the majority, was in her case an abyss that revealed the magnitude of what was lost. The deception was not always external. In some cases, the lie became a mechanism of survival imposed even by adults who wanted to protect them. Litzi, a girl who had passed through Theresienstadt, was given after the war to a man who said he was her father. For years she believed it, until in an adolescent argument he himself revealed the truth. He was her uncle. Her parents had been murdered. The life she had rebuilt crumbled in an instant, and she understood that she had been raised on a painful but necessary fiction. In contrast, to Mina, another survivor, the opposite occurred. She told how she had seen her mother killed by a shot. That image pursued her each day until years later the woman appeared alive. The childish memory, deformed by trauma, could create realities impossible to sustain. In both cases, the border between truth and lie was diffuse, and childhood had become a minefield of ambiguous memories and imposed silences. The reconstruction of life after 1945 was another chapter full of uncertainties. Thousands of children were taken to orphanages, reconverted convents, and collective homes. In England, France, or Palestine centers were established where they lived with other small survivors. They were called war orphans, unaccompanied children, or children damaged by the war. Never was it spoken of children of the Holocaust. That category would be invented much later. In those places, silence was part of the routine. They were asked to forget, to be fortunate for having survived, and to look forward. Many obeyed, although within themselves the questions continued to resound. Who am I? Where do I come from? Why am I still here and my brothers are not? Not all accepted that silence. Esther Raab, rescued from a camp, remembered that she needed to speak of what she had seen, but she found adults incapable of listening to her. That impossibility of transmitting the horror to those who had not lived it generated in her a feeling of radical loneliness. Decades later, already elderly, she said that only in the 1970s had she begun to feel recognized as a survivor. Until then, society preferred to see in those children new lives rather than marked lives. The psychological trauma manifested itself in multiple ways: nightmares, night terrors, inability to trust others, difficulty in forming effective bonds. George, who had survived hidden in Budapest, recounted how each shadow seemed to him the prelude of a new persecution. In Australia, Eva Marks, another saved child, spoke of her constant sensation that something bad was going to happen, even if she was in a safe environment. Many of them came to be successful professionals, parents, and grandparents, but they could never rid themselves of the invisible weight that childhood had imposed on them. The heroism of these children is not measured by military deeds, but by the obstinacy of living. Each decision, each hiding place, each sustained lie was an act of resistance. Srulek, for example, survived thanks to his capacity to flee and hide in the Polish forests. At barely 10 years old, he knew how to recognize when he should be silent, when he should run, and when he should beg. Those reflexes, acquired in desperation, were the difference between life and death. Dolly, another girl, found in her faith a reason to continue. She repeated prayers while she hid, convinced that each word was an invisible shield. The later history of these children is also that of a transformation. As adults, many became witnesses. They participated in trials against war criminals, in memory associations, in schools where they told what they had lived. In the 1980s and 1990s, when the generation of adult survivors was beginning to age, they assumed the role of the last direct voice of the catastrophe. Thomas Bürgenthal, turned into an international judge, used his own biography as a warning about the dangers of hatred and indifference. Others, like Eva M. or Judith Koppel, offered their testimonies in documentaries and oral archives. Each one of them, in narrating their childhood, gave back the voice to the millions of children who could not speak. The paradox of their existence is that they were called the fortunate ones, but for many that word was unbearable. They did not feel fortunate when comparing themselves with their gassed parents, their executed brothers, their neighbors turned into ashes. Luck, they said, was a weight that was carried like a condemnation. It was the obligation to live when everything around had died. That ambivalence accompanied the survivors for decades, being grateful for their life but also tormented by what it meant to have survived. Today, those who were those children are elderly. Their voices sound trembling, but they keep the strength of those who passed through hell. They represent the last generation capable of telling in the first person what it meant to be a child in times of the Holocaust. They are not only witnesses of a past, they are living reminders of what happens when childhood becomes the objective of extermination. Each one of them embodies not only fragility, but also the resistance of life in its purest state. The improbable existence of the surviving children forces us to rethink what it means to live after horror. They had to rebuild themselves without roots, without clear memories, without complete families. And yet, many managed to create homes, to have children, to leave testimonies. In their life is condensed the most bitter and most luminous lesson. Childhood can be broken, but not always destroyed. There, where it seemed impossible, these children demonstrated that life could still find its way. Nameless childhood, the lost identity of the children of the Holocaust. The Holocaust not only attempted to erase lives, it also sought to erase identities. For adults, persecution meant tattooed numbers, striped uniforms, and the reduction of the human being to a figure. For children, it also meant the loss of something even more fragile, their name. Many grew up responding to false identities, invented out of the urgency to survive, to the point of forgetting who they were before the catastrophe began. At the end of the war, when they were asked to remember, memory was an incomplete puzzle, riddled with silences, white lies, and gaps impossible to fill. From the beginning of the persecution, children were the most vulnerable to invisibilization. In ghettos and camps, the name quickly turned into a number. Judith Koppel, who went from shelter to shelter, never stopped asking as she grew up, "What is my real name?" Her insistence was a cry against the void. Having survived also meant carrying a constant doubt about one's own identity. Without a name, without family photos, without cradle memories, many felt like ghosts without a past. In other cases, the loss of the name was deliberate, designed by those who sought to protect them. Félicité Zimmern was a girl hidden on a French farm under the care of Juliette Patou. There she was renamed with a Catholic name, learned prayers, and moved among masses and fieldwork as if she had been born there. For years, that substitute identity became so natural that at the end of the war, the confusion was total. Was she Félicité, the daughter of a Jewish family annihilated, or the peasant girl with a cross on her neck? The dilemma was not only internal, but also external. The community, the caretakers, and even the rescuers themselves often preferred to maintain the fiction to prevent the child from falling once again into lack of protection. The case of Lizzie is one of the most dramatic. Upon leaving Theresienstadt, she was claimed by a man who said he was her father. The girl believed him for 11 years. She lived with him, called him Dad, built a childhood around that figure. But one day, in the middle of an adolescent argument, he shouted the truth at her. He was not her father, but her uncle. Her true parents had been murdered in the camps. In an instant, Lizzie's personal story collapsed like a poorly cemented building. The identity that had sustained her childhood was a white lie, necessary to give her stability, but impossible to bear when the truth was revealed. Other children lived the opposite paradox. Mina, another survivor of Theresienstadt, claimed to have seen a guard shoot her mother in the head. That memory became the axis of her fears and behaviors. But years later, the mother appeared alive. What Mina had recorded as a real event was a construction of trauma, an error of memory that accompanied her into adulthood. In this case, the problem was not the loss of a name, but the distortion of the personal story to the point of confusing truth with a painful fiction. Identity uprooting was not limited to the first years after the war. Many of these children grew up in countries far from their birthplaces. In England, Canada, Australia, or the United States, they adopted anglicized names, learned new languages, and adapted to different customs. Some did so with enthusiasm, convinced that they had to forget. Others lived it as a tearing. Andrew B., who arrived in England after the war, recounted that every time he had to sign with his new name, he felt he was betraying the memory of his parents. "It was as if someone tore off my skin," he said. The problem of the name was closely linked to memory. Whoever did not have their own name could not have a complete childhood story either. Memory became a torn fabric. Some tried to sew it with fragments, a smell in the mother's kitchen, a song heard in the ghetto, a gesture of the father. But without a name to organize those memories, everything became blurry. That struggle to rebuild identity accompanied survivors throughout their adult lives. For some, the only way to recover it was testimony, by narrating their story, by pronouncing their name aloud. They felt that they were restoring something that had been taken from them. The difficulty multiplied in adoption cases. After the war, humanitarian organizations sought foster families for thousands of children. At times, those children never knew they had living relatives. Jackie Young, who was adopted in England, discovered as an adult that his original name was not the one he had used throughout his life. The blow was as strong as it was liberating. Suddenly he understood why he had always felt an inexplicable emptiness when looking at childhood photos. Discovering his true name was like recovering a lost piece of himself, although at the same time it meant accepting the tragedy of his murdered parents. The silence of adults worsened the problem. Many guardians and relatives preferred not to talk about the past. They thought that this way they protected the children, that it was best for them to forget, but that silence turned into an insurmountable wall. The children grew up with unanswered questions. Why are there no photos of me as a baby? Why does my surname not match that of my adoptive parents? Why does everyone get tense when I ask about my mother? Each of those unanswered questions became an open wound. The absence of a name also had legal and social consequences. Without clear documents, many survivors had difficulties obtaining compensation, nationalities, or even passports. Some found out as adults that they had been born in another country than the one listed in their papers. Others never managed to recover their birth certificates. The bureaucratic state, which demanded proof, clashed with the reality of destroyed childhoods, where those proofs had disappeared with families, records, and communities. And yet, many of these children managed to rebuild themselves. The lost identity became a driving force for searching. Some dedicated themselves to investigating archives, tracing distant relatives, or reconstructing truncated genealogical trees. Others chose to narrate their story publicly, convinced that each testimony was a way of recovering the name of millions of children who had not survived. Ava M., for example, turned her lectures in schools into a ritual of restitution. By pronouncing her full name, she explained that she did it in memory of those who could never say theirs. The paradox of all this is that the name, that minimal mark that differentiates us from others, became a battlefield. In the extermination camps, the Nazis reduced children to numbers, stripping them of humanity. In shelters and homes, new identities were invented for them to protect them. In adoptive families, they were offered different names to integrate them. Each change sought a specific goal, but all of them implied the same cost: the dissolution of the original identity. The result was a generation of survivors who, upon reaching adulthood, had to reconstruct not only their life but also their very nominal existence. Today, the elderly who were those children know that they carry with them 2, 3, or even 4 names. Some accept them as layers of their history, others continue struggling to reconcile them. But all agree that the most important was the first, the one they could barely use, the one that remained suspended in a time before the war. Naming themselves is for them an act of resistance and memory. Because to say one's own name is to exist again, it is to defy oblivion, and it is to restore humanity to those who had been turned into shadows. Ultimately, the loss of names in the children of the Holocaust was a metaphor for the Nazi attempt to erase entire peoples. Surviving also meant recovering, even partially, that identity. And each time one of them pronounces their true name, they are saying something more than their personal story. They are giving back the voice to millions of children whose names were condemned to eternal silence. Reconstructed childhoods, the collective homes and orphanages of the survivors. When the war ended, Europe had become an immense cemetery. Among the ruins of Warsaw, Berlin, or Budapest, among the liberated camps of Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, wandered children who had been left alone. Some roamed aimlessly with the empty eyes of those who had already seen too much. Others were found hidden in barns, convents, or forests, resisting hunger as they could. They were the most improbable survivors of the Holocaust, those who had escaped the gas chambers by chance, the help of others, or their own cunning. Now, with the war over, they faced a new question: what to do with them? The first destination for many was the improvised orphanage. In France, England, Belgium, or Czechoslovakia, Jewish and Allied organizations opened collective homes where the children received hot food, clean clothes, and a bed. But those places were more than shelters. They were spaces of identity reconstruction. In Les Glycines, for example, the little ones who had survived hiding places and death marches shared for the first time an environment where they could speak aloud without fear of being denounced. At the table, simple dishes were served, and each smile was an act of resistance against the death that had wanted to take them away. The scene was repeated in different parts of Europe. In England, a group of 300 Jewish children was transferred to Calgarth Estate near Windermere. There, under the tutelage of social workers and psychologists, they tried to be children again. They learned to play football, to row on the lake, and to sleep without being startled. However, normality was only apparent. Jackie Young, one of those children, remembered that each night he awoke with the sensation that someone was chasing him. During the day, he laughed and ran. In the darkness, he was back in the camp, surrounded by screams and dogs. In France, the so-called boys of Buchenwald lived a particular experience. After being liberated, they were transferred to a castle in Taverny, where they received attention from pedagogues and doctors. The photographs of the time showed dozens of children with clothes too large, seated on wooden benches, trying to write their names on slates. Education was a form of reconstruction, but also a bridge toward the future. Many did not know how to read or write. They had spent their childhood among barbed wire and forced labor. Recovering literacy meant recovering the possibility of imagining a future. The collective homes were not only institutions of charity, they were also spaces of pedagogical experimentation. Psychologists, such as Anna Freud or Alice Goldberger, worked directly with the surviving children, trying to understand how trauma shaped their behavior. Goldberger, matron in a home in England, believed that speaking of experiences could help heal. She encouraged the children to recount what they remembered, even if they were dark fragments. Some improved after doing so. Others, on the other hand, were trapped in memories that overwhelmed them. The result was uncertain, but the attempt marked a starting point to recognize that those little ones were not simple war orphans, but subjects crossed by immense pain. In those spaces, tensions were also lived. For some, living together with other children was the first opportunity to feel part of a community since everything had been broken. For others, the noise of the collective dormitories evoked the barracks of the camps and was unbearable. There were those who escaped at night, convinced that sooner or later they would come to take them to be deported again. The routine of meals, games and school was a mask of normality under which fear remained alive. Often the homes became the setting for unexpected family reunions. Children who believed themselves to be orphans were claimed by distant relatives or acquaintances of their parents. Some of those reunions were real, others turned out to be deceptions. There were uncles who pretended to be fathers to avoid telling the truth, or families who adopted false identities to keep the little ones. In a French orphanage, a child was taken by a man who swore he was his father. Years passed until he discovered that he was his uncle. That type of situation revealed how fragile the border between truth and lie was in the post-war period. The problem of identity was accentuated with international adoptions. Children without clear papers were sent to England, Canada, Australia, or the United States. There they received new surnames and were raised as citizens of the receiving country. Many never knew that they had living relatives in Europe. Decades later, some discovered that their adoption names had replaced the original ones. Reconstruction in collective homes, in that sense, was a double experience. It offered material security, but at the price of pulling out still more roots. Nevertheless, in the midst of those contradictions, the collective homes gave rise to moments of tenderness and solidarity. In Taverny, the caregivers organized Shabbat celebrations for the children. They lit candles, sang songs, and served braided bread. For many, it was the first time they experienced a Jewish tradition without fear. In England, the children of Windermere went on bicycle excursions and learned to swim. The photos show them smiling, although behind each face there was a story of irreparable loss. Those instants of play were a reminder that childhood could still make its way among the ruins. With time, some homes became stable communities. In Palestine, for example, several groups of children were integrated into kibbutzim, where they found a mixture of substitute family and collective project. There they learned Hebrew, cultivated the land, and were part of the birth of the new state of Israel. Others, on the other hand, remained in European orphanages for years, waiting for news of relatives that never arrived. The waiting became part of the routine, waiting for letters, waiting for visits, waiting for the impossible return of the parents. Reconstruction in these homes did not always prevent the after-effects. Many children grew up with difficulties in trusting, with fear of bonds, or with a permanent sensation of instability. However, for some, collective life was a lifesaver. Eva M., for example, recounted that in her foster home in France, she learned to share again, to laugh with other children, and to imagine a future. "It was like being born for the second time," she said. Looking back, the collective homes and orphanages were places of transition. They did not resolve the trauma nor replace the lost families, but they offered a minimum of structure in a chaotic world. They were spaces where the survivors learned to pronounce their name, to read, to eat regularly, and to play without fear. They were also settings of silences and deceptions, where the truth about the past was often hidden. But above all, they were the proof that even after total destruction, it was still possible to reconstruct a glimpse of childhood. Today, the elderly who lived that experience remember those orphanages with mixed feelings. Some see them as the place where their new life began, others as institutions that perpetuated the loss of identity. But all agree that without them, survival would have been even more difficult. In those walls, among aligned beds and community kitchens, was forged the first generation of children capable of telling what it was like to grow up in the shadows of the Holocaust. Invisible wounds, the trauma of the children of the Holocaust. The end of the war did not mean the end of suffering for the children who survived the Holocaust. Their bodies may have come out alive from ghettos, hiding places, or camps, but their minds carried marks deeper than hunger or beatings. Each incomplete memory, each fragmented image, each imposed silence became an invisible wound that accompanied them all their lives. The adults of the post-war period called them the fortunate ones, but fortune had a price. The childhood that should have been full of games was replaced by experiences that no child's mind could process. Endless marches in the cold, dark hiding places, gunshots in the night, smells of burning bodies, cries of mothers separated from their children. Those episodes were imprinted in their memory as indelible scars. The problem was not only remembering but also forgetting. Many could not decide which of the two things was worse. Eva Marx, who was moved from place to place during the persecution, recounted that her adult life was marked by night terrors. She slept with the certainty that the Nazis would come to get her. Her body reacted as if the war had not ended: cold sweats, sudden starts, the impossibility of falling asleep without a lamp on. For her, rest was a battlefield as hard as any ghetto. George, another child survivor, described how every shadow seemed to him like a soldier. Even living in Melbourne, surrounded by security, he walked the streets with the feeling of being watched. That hypervigilance was a defense mechanism learned in childhood when survival depended on detecting any sign of danger within seconds. As an adult, that reflex became an invisible prison. He could not relax nor fully trust anyone. Childhood trauma was not limited to fear. It also generated feelings of guilt. Many grew up wondering why they had survived when their siblings, parents, or friends had not. Thomas Bergenthal spoke of that contradiction, the gratitude of having lived and the unbearable burden of knowing himself as a remnant. For him, survival was a duty toward the dead, an obligation to bear witness. But that mission did not eliminate the wound, it only gave it a purpose. Frozen emotions were another consequence. Some children grew up unable to cry or to express joy. They had learned to hide their emotions to survive. A tear could betray them in a hiding place. A smile could seem like insolence in front of a guard. That training in emotional repression, useful during the war, became an obstacle in adult life. Bernadette, a survivor interviewed years later, said that she could never hug her children with the spontaneity she would have wanted. "I was afraid of feeling too much," she confessed. Distrust of the world was another legacy of trauma. Children had learned that neighbors could denounce, that teachers could expel, that even acquaintances could turn into executioners. That early lesson carried into adulthood as an inability to believe in the goodness of others. Frankie, who had survived in Poland, recounted that every time a stranger smiled at him, he wondered what trap lay behind it. The result was a life marked by isolation and difficulty in creating stable bonds. The after effects extended to the body. Many survivors developed psychosomatic illnesses, chronic pain, digestive problems, persistent headaches. The body seemed to remember what the mind tried to conceal. Prolonged hunger in ghettos or hiding places left marks on metabolism. Constant fear altered their nervous systems. Richard, who had been in the Lublin ghetto, recounted that every time he heard a dog bark, his body reacted with uncontrolled tachycardia, reliving the memory of the animals that the guards used to hunt children. Trauma also manifested in the difficulty of forming their own families. Some survivors feared bringing children into a world that had proven capable of exterminating millions. Others, on the contrary, clung to the idea of creating life as an act of resistance. But even in those cases, parenthood was marked by the shadow of the past. Eva M. recounted that she could not bear to be separated from her children even for a few hours. Each school farewell was experienced as the prelude to a definitive loss. The silence imposed by adults after the war deepened the trauma. Many guardians or relatives avoided speaking of the past, convinced that forgetting was best. But for the children, that silence was an unbearable void. The unanswered questions: where is my mother? Why do I not have baby photos? Why does my surname not match? Became painful obsessions. Trauma lay not only in what they had lived, but also in what they were denied to know. As the decades passed, some found in testimony a way to face those wounds. Speaking in public, writing memoirs, or participating in interviews was for many a way to transform trauma into collective memory. Jackie Young said that telling his story was like taking a weight off his chest, even though at the same time it revived the pains. Others, however, remained silent all their lives. The trauma was so deep that putting it into words was impossible. Intergenerational transmission was another significant phenomenon. The children of these children grew up perceiving a pain they did not fully understand. There was in their parents a constant sadness, an inexplicable fear of loss, a rigidity in discipline. The grandchildren, in turn, received that legacy in the form of fragmented stories, photographs, and incomplete memories. The wound of the Holocaust was transmitted like an echo, a silent mark that crossed generations. And yet, in the midst of so much darkness, there was also resilience. Some managed to transform trauma into creative strength or social commitment. Becoming doctors, judges, teachers, or writers, they dedicated their lives to building a more just world. Not all achieved it, of course. Many remained trapped in depression or isolation. But the existence of those who managed to rebuild themselves shows the complexity of trauma. It was not only destruction, it was also the seed of new forms of resistance. The trauma of the children of the Holocaust reminds us that childhood is the most vulnerable and, at the same time, the most resilient ground. The invisible wounds they carried into old age were not scars that closed with time. They were permanent marks that shaped their entire lives. Today, when those children are elderly, their voices tremble as they remember, but they still carry the strength of those who learned too soon that the world could turn into a hostile place. The most terrible thing was not only what they lived in their childhood, but the certainty that that past would never leave them. The Holocaust ended in 1945, but for them, in their dreams, in their bodies, and in their memories, it never fully ended. Broken families, reunions, adoptions, and searches after the Holocaust. When the war ended, the youngest survivors emerged from hiding places, convents, basements, and camps. Many came into the world with a single certainty: they were alone. The majority had lost their parents, brothers, and grandparents. In some cases, they were the last survivors of entire families. The end of the conflict brought with it a task as painful as it was necessary: to try to rebuild family life in the midst of devastation. The first step was the search. Organizations such as the International Red Cross received thousands of requests for information about missing children. The tracing offices in Europe filled with lists, photographs, and letters. Each name was a hope, each coincidence a possible miracle. The collective homes and orphanages became meeting points. Their distant relatives or supposed family members arrived to claim the children. Some reunions were real and emotional, others turned out to be deceptions, products of confusion or of pious lies. The case of Litzy shows it with harshness. Newly liberated from Theresienstadt, a man appeared in her orphanage claiming to be her father. She believed him for 11 years until in an argument he himself confessed that he was in reality her uncle. The truth was unbearable. Her parents had been murdered. The lie had been born from the desire to protect her, to give her a paternal figure that would spare her from total emptiness. But when it was revealed, the wound was double. She lost the father she had idealized and confirmed the irremediable absence of the real ones. In contrast, there were children who received unexpected news that their parents were still alive. Mina, convinced that she had seen her mother die from a gunshot, lived for years with that image in her mind. Until one day the woman appeared, the initial relief mixed with bewilderment, how to trust in one's own memories when memory had invented a tragedy. These cases, although less frequent, showed the instability of the childish experience in the midst of horror. The border between the real and the imagined could be confused without remedy. The family reunions were often traumatic. Parents who had survived concentration camps tried to recover their children after years of separation. But the children, raised in convents or foster families, did not always recognize them. Some spoke another language, practiced another religion, or even resisted leaving the safety of their adoptive environment. The returns were charged with tensions. For the parents, the hope of starting over. For the children, the confusion of returning with strangers who claimed to be their family. Religion was one of the most delicate conflicts. Many children had been secretly baptized to protect them during the occupation. After the war, ecclesiastical institutions sometimes resisted returning them to Jewish relatives or community organizations, arguing that they should remain on the spiritual path they had begun. This generated legal and moral tensions, where the identity of the child was debated between survival and tradition. When there were no direct relatives, the children were put up for adoption. England, France, Canada, the United States, and Australia received hundreds of them. New surnames, new languages, and new customs were imposed on fractured childhoods. Jackie Young, adopted in England, discovered as an adult that his original name was not the one he had used during his whole life. The blow was brutal. He had lived under an alien identity while his true roots remained buried in archives and graves. Adoption was not always a harmonious process. Some children rejected their new parents, unable to detach themselves from the memory of those they had lost. Others, on the contrary, clung desperately to the new family, fearing to be abandoned again. The relationship was marked by the trauma of the original separation. Trust was fragile, affections contradictory. The adoptive parents, no matter how much love they offered, could not erase the shadow of the dead. In many cases, family reconstruction extended to entire communities. In Palestine, kibbutzim welcomed groups of orphans, becoming collective families where the children learned Hebrew, worked the land, and found a sense of belonging. There, Jewish identity was rebuilt as a national and community project. The children who had lost their parents found in the kibbutz a form of affiliation that sustained them. But even in those environments, the past remained present. Some awoke screaming at night, convinced that the guards would return. Others refused to eat black bread because it reminded them of the hunger of the ghetto. The new families could offer shelter and food, but they could not erase the weight of the memories. The search for relatives extended for decades. Some survivors, already adults, dedicated their lives to tracing names in archives, traveling to the cities of their childhood, or contacting distant relatives on other continents. Each discovery, each recovered photo, was a victory against forgetting, but also a source of pain, confirming the death of parents, discovering disappeared brothers, accepting that the entire family had been annihilated. Family trauma was transmitted to the following generations. Children and grandchildren of the surviving children grew up hearing fragments of stories, seeing silent tears, or feeling the pressure of an unresolved past. Many of them inherited the task of investigating, reconstructing truncated genealogical trees and giving voice to those who could not tell their story. In spite of everything, there were those who managed to create solid families. Some survivors married, had children, and found in family life a form of resistance against extermination. Each birth was an affirmation that the Nazis had not achieved their objective. But even in those families, the shadow of the Holocaust was felt. Overprotection, fear of losses, difficulty in expressing affection were invisible marks transmitted to the children. Family reconstruction after the Holocaust was, in reality, a permanent struggle between loss and hope. For many children, it meant growing up among changed surnames, diffused memories, and painful silences. For others, it was the possibility of finding new parents, foster brothers, and communities that gave them back belonging. In all cases, it was a process charged with ambiguity, where love was mixed with absence and life with the memory of death. Today, those who were those children, now elderly, continue asking themselves who their parents were, how their original name sounded, or what happened to their brothers. Each answer found is a triumph against destruction, but also a wound that opens. Reconstruction was never complete because no family could be fully reassembled after the genocide. But in that search, in that attempt to reunite what had been broken, lies the essence of their resistance, refusing to disappear even when everything had been designed to erase them. Resilience, from child survivors to witnesses of memory. The childhood of Holocaust survivors was marked by persecution, loss, and fear. Nothing in those years anticipated that they could become adults capable of rebuilding a life, forming families, or assuming public responsibilities. And yet, many did. What in childhood was desperation and fragility over time was transformed into resilience, into the obstinacy of living when everything seemed destined for disappearance. It was not a linear or simple process. The resilience of these children was not a natural gift, but a painful construction upon the ruins of their past. Each one had to find a different path to survive not only the war, but also the post-war. Some found in education an anchor, others in artistic creation, many in militancy for memory. What united them was the need to give meaning to a suffering that otherwise would have become unbearable. Thomas Björgenthal is one of the most significant examples. After passing through Auschwitz and surviving a death march at barely 11 years old, he was able to rebuild his life in the United States. He studied law, became a prestigious international judge, and dedicated his career to the defense of human rights. In his case, resilience was manifested in transforming horror into a commitment to universal justice. He could not restore life to his parents, nor erase his memories of hunger and violence, but he could prevent the world from forgetting what had happened. Other survivors found their resilience in writing. Eva M., for example, turned her experience into a source of testimony. She visited schools and universities, recounted what she had lived in her childhood, and answered difficult questions from young people who could not imagine the magnitude of the horror. For her, speaking was a form of resistance. By pronouncing her name, by narrating her memories, she returned the humanity that the Nazis had tried to strip from her. Each word was an act of personal and collective reconstruction. Some leaned on faith. Dolly, hidden during the war, said that her ability to recite prayers in the moments of greatest danger had given her strength to survive. In the post-war period, she maintained that spiritual practice as a refuge. Others, on the other hand, rejected all religion, unable to understand how a God could have allowed the slaughter of millions of children. In both cases, the relationship with faith was part of the process of resilience. Whether as support or as rupture, it represented an attempt to dialogue with the inexplicable. Resilience was also expressed in the ability to form new families. For many, having children was an act of defiance against extermination. Each birth was a symbolic victory over those who had wanted to erase the Jewish people. Eva Marx, who had been moved from place to place during the war, said that embracing her grandchildren was the most forceful answer against Hitler. However, motherhood and fatherhood were not free of shadows. Overprotection, constant fear of loss, and emotional difficulties accompanied these families. Resilience did not mean the absence of pain, but the decision to live in spite of it. Education was another crucial tool. Many survivors, deprived of school during the war, clung to study as a way of rebuilding stolen childhood. Some became doctors, engineers, teachers, or renowned artists. Their success did not erase the scars, but it allowed them to build a positive identity in a world that had treated them as waste. In diplomas, in professional achievements, in recognitions, they saw proof that ruined childhood had not been the end of their story. Art and memory also became paths of resilience. Paintings, poems, memoirs, and films were born from the experiences of those children. By creating, they could give form to the unnameable. The drawing of a barracks, the description of a smell, the reconstruction of a march were attempts to translate trauma into something communicable. Not all managed to do so, but those who could found in art a way of reconciling with life. Resilience was not individual, it was also collective. Groups of survivors began to gather in associations, conferences, and international meetings. In those spaces, they could speak without fear, recognize themselves in the pain of the other, and build a community that supported them. Paul Vallant, psychiatrist and child survivor, recounted that when founding a group of survivors in Melbourne, he felt for the first time that he was not alone. It was as if, after decades of isolation, he had found an extended family that shared the same wound. Resilience, however, did not mean forgetting nor total overcoming. Many carried nightmares, anxiety, and guilt all their lives, but instead of letting them destroy them, they transformed them into driving forces for action. Some worked in humanitarian organizations, others dedicated themselves to teaching history. Several participated in trials against war criminals. Memory became their main weapon, and resilience was expressed in the fact of not remaining silent. The most extraordinary thing about this resilience is that it was born from children who, during the war, had been stripped of everything: name, family, food, refuge. They survived nothingness, and from that nothingness, they built a life. Each story is different, but all show that broken childhood did not prevent adulthood, although it conditioned it. Today, the elderly who were those children are remembered not only as victims, but as witnesses and teachers. Their resilience is not in having forgotten, but in having kept memory alive. By telling their story in schools, museums, and universities, they transformed pain into warning. They are the last generation capable of narrating in the first person what it meant to grow up in hell, and their ability to turn that past into teaching is the deepest expression of their resistance. The resilience of the children of the Holocaust cannot be romanticized. It did not erase losses, it did not eliminate suffering, but it allowed pain not to be sterile, to be turned into voice, into memory, into life. Each testimony is a reminder that even in the darkest scenarios, the human being can find a way to go on, and that sometimes the greatest victory is not defeating the enemy, but refusing to cease to exist. The fortunate ones, the guilt of having survived. When the war ended, the children who had managed to escape death were immediately called the fortunate ones. But that label, far from being a consolation, became an unbearable weight. How could one feel fortunate after having seen one's parents die on a platform, one's brothers in a camp, one's friends in a ghetto? For many, survival was a condemnation in itself, to live carrying the unanswered question of why they were alive and not the others. The guilt of the survivor manifested itself from the first days of liberation. Thomas Bürgenthal remembered that upon leaving Auschwitz he felt gratitude for being alive, but at the same time a deep pain when looking around and seeing that the majority of the children had disappeared. At barely 11 years old, he was already asking himself what sense survival had if his childhood was destroyed and his family annihilated. The word luck did not console him, it was a label that confronted him with the abyss of losses. The feeling was repeated in other testimonies. Eva M. said that each time someone congratulated her for having escaped death, she felt it as an open wound. "I am not fortunate," she affirmed. "I am the one who remained." That phrase sums up the paradox. Survival was not a victory, but a constant proof of loneliness. Being the one who remained meant carrying on the shoulders the memory of the absent, as if each day lived after the war were a painful tribute to the dead. For some, guilt manifested itself in silence. Jackie Young, adopted in England, spent decades without speaking of what he had seen. He did not want to be called fortunate nor to be looked at as a special survivor. He felt that his life was the consequence of an injustice. He had been chosen by chance, while others, perhaps more deserving, had been condemned to die. Keeping silent was his way of not having to confront that unbearable question. Others expressed guilt in the form of self-destruction. There were those who turned to alcohol, to unstable relationships, or to radical solitude. The unprocessed trauma found an outlet in behaviors that distanced them from any idea of normality. Frankie, who had survived in Poland, recounted that for years he sabotaged himself in his studies and jobs because he felt he had no right to succeed. "Why should I have success if my schoolmates were buried in mass graves?" he said. The stolen childhood made the feeling of guilt even more devastating. Unlike adults, children did not have a rational framework to interpret what was happening. Many thought in secret that if their parents had died and they had not, it was because they had done something wrong. That childish logic, absurd but powerful, became a nucleus of anguish that dragged on for decades. Juliette, a girl hidden in France, confessed as an adult that she believed she had betrayed her mother for not having screamed when she was separated from her. The scene pursued her each time she closed her eyes. The label of fortunate ones did not come only from outside, but also from the Jewish community. In the first years after the war, the surviving children were presented as symbols of hope, the proof that life could continue. They were shown in photographs smiling in collective homes as evidence that the tragedy had been overcome. But behind those smiles were nightmares, night terrors, and a sense of uprootedness that the word fortune could not disguise. Guilt multiplied in adulthood when forming families. Many felt that each child born was also a reminder of the children their parents had not been able to raise. Eva Marx recounted that each time she embraced her grandchildren, she thought of the brothers who had not survived, and of the children her parents had not been able to see grow. It was an act of love, but also of endless mourning. Some managed to transform guilt into mission. Thomas Bürgenthal dedicated his life to international law and the defense of human rights, convinced that his survival implied a responsibility. It was not about being fortunate, but about being a witness. His resilience consisted of converting the question, "Why me?" into the answer, "So that the world does not forget." Others did the same in different fields, in art, in education, in the struggle for memory, but not all were able to give it meaning. There were those who died without having been able to reconcile themselves with their own survival. For them, each birthday was a reminder that millions of children had not lived to blow out their candles. Life was lived with a mixture of gratitude and bitterness, like a poisoned gift. The weight of being called fortunate ones was also transmitted to their children. Many grew up hearing fragmented stories, seeing their parents cry in silence or perceiving the invisible burden they carried. The second generation inherited not only the trauma, but also the mission of justifying that survival. Some did so by studying the Holocaust, others by building solid families, others by dedicating themselves to education, but all carried in some way the inheritance of guilt. Today, the elderly who were those children look back and still feel the contradiction. They do not see themselves as fortunate, but as witnesses. They know that their life was marked by absence, that each personal achievement was built on the foundations of a collective loss. Fortune, if it existed, was not that of having lived longer, but that of being able to tell what happened. That is the inheritance they have left. The certainty that despite guilt and pain, their voice could return humanity to those who did not survive. Ultimately, the guilt of the survivor reveals the cruelest paradox of the Holocaust. Even those who escaped death were wounded forever. Childhood never again became what it should have been, and the word fortunate became a constant reminder of the millions who did not have that improbable chance to live. The true fortune for them was not in having survived, but in being able to transform the weight of that survival into shared memory. The last witnesses, memory in the voice of those who were children. At the end of the war, the youngest survivors were not immediately recognized as authoritative voices of the Holocaust. They were considered too small, too confused, too fragmentary in their memories. For decades, they lived in the shadow of the testimonies of adults, while their own experience was minimized or dismissed. But over time, those children turned into elderly people, assumed a crucial role. They became the last living witnesses of the genocide. In the first post-war years, the priority was to rebuild communities, recover the remnants of Jewish life, and judge the criminals. The dominant narrative was offered by adults who had seen, with full consciousness, the machinery of death. The children, on the other hand, were perceived as the fortunate ones, without understanding that they carried a unique trauma. Only in the decades of the 1970s and the 1980s, with the rise of Holocaust research and the creation of oral archives, did their voice begin to be valued. Their something evident was revealed. No one could convey better than they what it meant to lose childhood in the midst of extermination. Each testimony was a time capsule. Jackie Young, who had been adopted in England, recounted in interviews how he discovered his true name as an adult. Relating it was not only recovering his identity, it was showing the world the fracture that genocide had caused in millions of children. Eva M. visited schools and museums, narrating how she had lived in hiding and how after the war she had to learn again to trust others. Her account was not only personal, it was a mirror where young people could see the extreme vulnerability of childhood in the face of hatred. Thomas Bergenthal turned into an international judge, repeated in conferences that his very presence was a reminder. "I survived to tell," he said. For him, speaking about the Holocaust was not an act of catharsis, but a moral duty. Not all were able to do so. There were those who never uttered a word about their childhood, but those who did became guardians of a memory that, without them, ran the risk of dissolving into statistics. What made these witnesses unique was precisely the childlike perspective. Their memories were fragmentary, emotional, full of sensory images. They did not speak of great military strategies nor of numbers. They spoke of smells, of noises, of gestures. Eva Marx recounted how the sound of footsteps could freeze her body with fear even decades later. Frankie remembered the barking of dogs in the ghetto as the constant music of his childhood. Those details, impossible to invent, conveyed the rawness of trauma in a direct and heartbreaking way. With the passing of the years, the child survivors understood that they were the last generation capable of bearing witness in the first person. Their words became a bridge between history and new generations. In schools of Europe, the United States, Israel, and Latin America, their accounts were heard by thousands of students. In museums and memorials, they recorded interviews that today form part of audio-visual archives. Each narration was a seed planted against oblivion, but being guardians of memory had a cost. Constantly reliving the memories meant facing pain again. Some survivors confessed that each talk in a school was like reopening a wound. However, they did it convinced that silence would be even worse. Resilience was expressed in that ability to transform suffering into teaching, even if it meant bleeding again in public. The role of child survivors as witnesses also allowed aspects of the Holocaust that had remained in the shadows to be illuminated, while adult testimonies focused on the organization of camps, deportations, or trials. The children's accounts revealed the intimacy of persecution, fear in hiding places, confusion at separations, the helplessness of seeing parents humiliated. It was the most human and heartbreaking dimension, the one that reminded us that genocide was not only a crime against a people, but against childhood itself. The memory of these survivors was not homogeneous. Some had clear memories of specific scenes, others only fragments. But in that diversity lay also their strength. The mosaic of voices conveyed a collective experience. It did not matter if a child had survived in a French convent, in a Polish forest, or in a German camp. All shared the mark of having lost the most essential thing of childhood, trust in the world. Today, when most of them are over 80 years old, it is known that their voices are irreplaceable. Each death of a survivor is the disappearance of a living library. That awareness has given them a sense of urgency, recording interviews, writing memoirs, speaking in schools, participating in documentaries. They know that in little time the Holocaust can only be told through archives and books. That is why they insist that their testimonies are not only stories of the past, but warnings for the present. The extraordinary thing is that those children who were once invisible became references. At first, they were not recognized as full survivors, but over time they were accepted as bearers of a unique truth. Their memory, made of tears and fragments, turned out to be as valuable as any official document, because in their voices was the most intimate experience of genocide, that of innocence stolen. Ultimately, the children who survived the Holocaust bequeathed us something more than their personal story. They gave us a lesson about memory itself. They reminded us that even when the world tries to erase names, families, and entire communities, there always remains the possibility that someone will tell, that someone will remember. They were the last witnesses, and their mission was to transform the wound into word so that future generations would know what it means to grow up under the sign of extermination. And so each time one of them stepped onto a school stage or turned on a camera to give their testimony, the silence of millions of murdered children found a voice. That is the greatest victory against oblivion, that the last witnesses, those who were once called simply the fortunate ones, could return humanity to the absent with the strength of their memory. The childhood that never ended. When the war ended, the youngest survivors came out of basements, convents, camps, and forests believing that at last they had escaped horror. But the reality was another. The war never truly ended for them. The childhood they lost continued to mark every instant of their adult life. There was no game that did not recall a hiding place, no family that did not carry the shadow of the absent, no dawn that did not evoke the certainty that at any moment someone could once again take everything away from them. The children of the Holocaust grew up carrying an unbearable paradox. They had survived, but they did so mutilated in their trust, in their identity, and in their memory. Society called them the fortunate ones, without understanding that that word was a knife. They were not fortunate, they were the ones who remained, the ones who had to build a life upon invisible ruins, the ones who learned to love and to raise children with fear, the ones who formed families knowing that nothing could replace what was lost. Their existence was a form of resistance. Where the Nazis had wanted to erase entire generations, they became witnesses. Each word spoken in a school, each memory recorded in an archive, each book written was a response to the attempt at extermination. They did not need uniforms nor slogans. It was enough to stand, to say their name, to remember those who did not return. Resilience did not mean forgetting. On the contrary, it was the ability to live with pain without letting it consume them, Some transformed it into art, others into teaching, others into the struggle for justice. Each one, in their own way, turned trauma into active memory. But even those who never spoke, those who died in silence, were part of that resistance. Their very life, their children and grandchildren, were a reminder that barbarity had not managed to erase completely the seed of childhood. Today, those children are elderly. Their voices tremble, their bodies bend, but in their eyes still burns the intensity of those who saw human evil too soon. They know they are the last direct witnesses of what happened. They also know that, when they fall silent forever, the weight of memory will remain in the hands of those of us who listened to them. That is why they insist on narrating even when their voice breaks and tears interrupt their sentences. The legacy of the children of the Holocaust is not only historical, it is profoundly human. They remind us that childhood is not invulnerable, that it can be the object of hatred and the most brutal violence. They force us to look beyond the numbers and to see concrete faces: a boy who lost his name, a girl who thought she saw her mother die, an adolescent who asked himself all his life why he and not his brother had survived. They are stories that break the distance of history and confront us with the essential fragility of the human condition. The final chapter of their life is not written in the camps nor in the graves, but in the memory they transmit. There lies their victory, having transformed a broken childhood into collective testimony. The Holocaust sought to erase every trace of them. Instead, they became guardians of the truth. And thanks to their voices, the millions of murdered children also speak through them. That is the ultimate meaning of their existence, reminding us that even when everything seems destined for death, life finds a crack to assert itself. The children of the Holocaust, with their invisible wounds and obstinate strength, embody warning and hope. The warning that no people is safe from hatred when dehumanization is normalized, and the hope that even after hell, memory, justice, and life can still sprout. The world of today, with its new violences and displacements, still needs their lesson. Because as long as there is a child persecuted for their identity, the story of those survivors will continue repeating itself somewhere else. To remember them is not a gesture of the past, it is an urgency of the present. Thus closes the story of the children who survived the Holocaust, not as a peaceful ending, but as a heritage that obliges us to listen, to transmit, and to resist oblivion. Their childhood never ended because it remained suspended in time as a warning, and their voice, that of the last witnesses, will continue to resound as long as there is someone willing to name them.